This is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and this is Sunday, September the 15th, 2019, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, kind of wet greenways at the moment because it's raining outside, but I hear it's going to clear up by this afternoon, so it should be a good day for bicycling, and whatever else Dave has been up to for the last week.
Okay, we have a guest, Susan Taylor, who is very supportive of what we do, and she might like to say hi.
Hi. Perfect.
So, okay. Start off with in passing. We had mentioned this before, but there was a memorial to Charlotte Brady, who was an artist and naturalist and did watercolor paintings, and I'll show one of those.
So those of you listening on the radio right now can't possibly, but Dave is holding it up because if you watch this when it goes up on UPTV or when it goes up on YouTube, you'll actually see what the print is that Dave is talking about.
So some of the people I was meeting there we've known for a long, long time. And Charlotte was an interesting teacher. She moved into Mohammed area and took over a storefront which she made into a gallery, and she had quite a lot of impact on Monticello. She also had a family background. I found out from talking to a relative from Peoria that she also had an Indian background. Small though it might have been, but it was there. So she's a local. And yeah, I'm just looking at my notes. Oh, and they had really nice flowers, and I thought that was wonderful. So a very nice memorial to her at the Unitarian Church, which is a church that had a very mixed bag of people, and they were there. Chronologically, this week has been a busy week. Started off with WEFFest and lots of music and friendly association and raffles, and I think that brought in something like $900. And some of the people were playing, Washington and others, had been at the Eleanor Guitar Festival that just finished last week. Eleanor, in case you don't know, was the wife of Cranit, and she had a lot to do with designing Cranit, and so this festival is named after her. On Tuesday, I went to Mattoon, my little CRX that Tom Rudnick gave us many years ago. Took the road well, and when I got to Mattoon, somebody saw me at Casey's and wanted to congratulate me on having a CRX. She must have had something to do with it. But it's a popular little car, especially with high school students. Got to the Committee on Natural Areas meeting, and there were probably 50 people there. They were at the Douglas Hart Nature Center, and a nice little visitor center, and so there was general business, the usual agendas and reports, but there was also the new vice administrator for the Department of Natural Areas, I think. And so there's some state change, and it's likely that natural areas will get a slightly better deal than it has had recently. The main first two items were dedication of considerable blocks of land that have been acquired by the Grand Prairie Friends. I think one was 175, and I think one might have been 200 acres, but it's a considerable amount designated as a soil and water conservation easement. The designation of a pure natural area, it has to be really a very good natural area. And this is forest that is regrowth. It's been cut over, and it's on the banks of the Umbrella River, and it's typically the Nature Preserves Commission will designate it as a secondary level acquisition. It applies also to things like the 9 acres of buffer zone around the prairie at Loader. It's a little bit on the rough and tough side. So, but that was interesting, and we have a new director to replace Mary Kay Salecki for this region. Talked to him for a while, and there were other designations, and there was quite a bit of argument about giving designations to a natural area that had trails through it originally. And so do trails go with natural areas? We had something of the same question following the various meetings, and that one was a long one to discuss. And it was an interim one. This is where you present your case, and then the Department of Natural Resources and Committee on Natural Areas does some research to see whether this is a genuine situation. Then probably also does it have endangered species on it and things like that. So then you come back again and resubmit. They have about 3 meetings a year, and they move it around the state. So I've been down to southern Illinois, and I've also been to northern Illinois, and sometimes to western Illinois. I meet up with people there. I talked down to the Morehouse, and she's a regional director in the West, and I asked her about the North American Prairie Conference, and she said, well, we think it's going to be in Des Moines, Iowa, and in July 2020. And just those sorts of exchanges are good. There were quite a few people from the Coles County area there, and afterwards I took a walk around the Douglas Hart Nature Center. It's probably, I would guess, about 65 acres of woodland, then with what looks like a purchase nearby for a pond, a natural area around the pond, and then looked like another purchase to the back, which is a sort of reconstruction prairie, and it butts into an edge timber. There were labels, then maps, and trees were labeled not only with a name, but they were labeled with a picture of the leaf or some characteristic thing. The trail in that 65 acres, probably 1.5 miles long, and then to go with it, a meeting space that the Committee on Natural Areas was meeting in, plus a museum. And so it sort of has that you could do a surprising amount with a fairly small forested area. and I think they would call it a woodland rather than a forest. The trails were chipped limestone, and I'm just watching. So I think I've covered most of that. I did present. At the end of the meeting, you get to present, and you have to be brief. But I had two topics. One was the width of the rail trail between Urbana and Danville. I would wish that the Committee on Natural Areas in this case would be advocates, not only for the Kickapoo Trail, but also for the trail between Wilmington and Mansfield, and that it would not be 10 feet wide, and that it would be 4 feet wide. So I was making suggestions and hoping that that would roll over to the Department of Natural Resources. I also wanted to say something about a very good wide prairie that we've been talking about between Rantoul and Paxton. It's got a main line, and a retired interurban, a retired road, and a second leg of a dual highway that was never installed, so it's also adjunct space. And it's got the old Route 45 is intact as a concrete road with a dual space. So it's good for recreators, and I would hope that it might be included in budgets for alternate forms of transportation. That means the Department of Transportation would be concerned. It also owns most of the land. And then Department of Natural Resources, and the Department of Natural Resources has a unit for bicycle ways. And Susan and I have at some time been over to talk to those people. And you have to be careful that it's not overly commercialized and recreation only. We're looking for the prairie and the prairie soils. And the rolling nature of a corridor going up and over the Bloomington Moraine, with at the bottom of the moraine it's wet and sloppy, very typical of what Champaign County was like in early days. And 94% prairie, not a lot of trees, and then going up the hill to the drier species like little bluestem on the top, and the rolling nature is characteristic of a moraine that has palmate draining. That means if you put your hand out, the creeks come out of that moraine in a palmate manner and go into a wetland. So once again, encouraging advocacy and talking amongst the official people who would be involved in taking over that 10 miles and making it a creative trail that would join another trail that goes through Rantoul at right angles. I poked around in Mattoon a little bit. I was interested to know what happened to the old railroad stations. The main railroad station was Illinois Central, but there was another railroad line that went across. So you had two levels of railroad, and I just poked around for a little while and then left for Arcola. On the way, I went past Humboldt. Humboldt was interesting because Humboldt took a lot of the sewage sludge from Chicago for quite some time. So I had these big ponds of sewage sludge. It stopped after a while, but it's a very popular place for Audubon type people because people like the birds, especially like the wetlands, and it's rich because of the sewage. So you also have nutriment for the creatures. It was stopped after a while. I think it was because there were heavy metals in there, and it was concentrating them, and not very good for the wildlife. Got into Arcola. At Arcola, we spent a lot of time, many years in fact, trying to preserve part of, or all of, 56 miles of railroad bed between Paris and Heavey City, which is near Decatur. It was a Penn Central line, and we were anxious to encourage the Department of Natural Resources to acquire that bed, if nothing else, as a rail trail. But we knew very well that it was loaded with some of our last prairie remains, remnants. Unfortunately, in the last administration, it was decided to turn that railroad bed back to farmers because it couldn't be consumed, or what would you call it, instigated as a trail, because there were 11 plots of land that had already been bought by farmers. So as that goes back to corn and soybeans, we'll be losing a lot of prairie. But in the process, we met up with the Lidman family that owned a plot of land just near the cloverleaf that exits our entrances, Arcola. And it's 35 years since we put prairie into that little plot. And so I went to check it out. I check it out every once in a while. It's growing some trees around the edge, which is not so hot. And there's been herbicide on the adjacent roadside. So I have a picture of big blue stem herbicide. But usually the herbicide doesn't get the grasses because it's a glyphosate, and glyphosates don't get the grasses, they get the broadleaves. Well, I found my way in, and I will put up some pictures of this on the internet and on YouTube. There's individual species. It's hard for us to say too much about the individual species, but there's flowering at the moment, almost in seed, is ironweed, which we sowed there. It's a tall plant, and it's blue at the present time. And I picked some of the older ones and stuffed them in my pocket. And there's other species, quite a lot of boneset out at the present time. New England aster, big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, indigo, what I usually refer to as baptisia, and with its pods, and absolutely wonderful pods. So this is a nice little prairie. Every once in a while it gets looked at for possible development. If so, that prairie is rich in plants that should be salvaged. If it was left open as in broomcorn festival time with labels, and then it could be quite a museum piece. So I was really quite pleased with that. There was rattlesnake mouse and rose, and I turned around, it was getting late, and there was the moon up above the adjacent motel, which is very near. This is urban prairie. During the week, I made a visit to the IDOT garage, where we involved when we're on adjacent land that is usually owned by IDOT, but we have a small strip of about 50 feet wide between the highway that goes down to Savoy, Route 45, goes further south. And we managed to keep that plot viable. And once you get to Curtis Road, the expanded road, which went from 2 lanes to 3 lanes to 5 lanes, is right up against the railroad line, so there's none of this 50 feet left for nature. So we're very jealous of it. It's very hard to burn because the railroad doesn't like you burning things, but with a lot of care we can do that. But it's also labeled with signs to say no more. And there are 2 types of signs. There are the signs that went in with our original bargain, which was to have a low-profile prairie down to the drainage ditch. Well, that's what we have, and it's growing. And all of a sudden, August first comes, and that's when mowing starts. And so down to the drain. And down to the drain with a 15-foot bush hog, and the prairie is mown. So I found some staff people who actually did the mowing, and they understand who we are. It's on the backside of a moraine called the Pesota moraine, and the soil is very soft. And Savoy puts its housing drains into a ditch that's alongside the prairie. And so as the water runs down to the creek that's a tributary of the Ombra, it takes down the silt. And every once in a while I get truckloads of silt that taken out. Shortly ago, the drain was deepened, took out some prairie, but we had a conversation about it, and how that's better than going along with a bulldozer with a laser beam on it and sculpting the whole area and then giving it back to us all disturbed with the prairie plants not mature. This is stuff that is original in some cases, and if it's been planted or dipsy-doodled with seed, it's at least 25 years old. And so to sit on the side of the road and take out the drain was very, very helpful. The argument is that cars that have problems would like to run off the road, and they don't want to run into a prairie. I've heard that song before. There's also the argument that there might be a giraffe or a alligator in there too, so you don't want the animals running out onto the road. Alongside the road there is an 8-foot space, which is quite adequate for a car to stop without even going in the prairie. But if you want to go into the prairie, it's a short profile prairie, and you should be able to see your way to park. But it's also a difficulty for Department of Transportation people, because they increasingly find that they have fires set forth by somebody throwing out a cigarette or by an exhaust pipe that's not behaving itself very well. So you need to have equipment that has a spray on the front that can put out a grass fire. This is different from a building fire. And so not everyone has access to that sort of equipment, but that would make it simpler to work with. So we left with a sense of humor. These people know who I am, and they sort of applaud the passion, they call it, but it is also our gene pool. And that 1 mile is the only prairie that many of our local citizens are ever going to see, let alone their grandchildren. So this is a public access. It's right alongside the highway. If it's a football game and you have to go at 2 mile an hour, because there's traffic, then it's seen, and it is cherished. So how do we balance that against the mowing? I was talking to administrators, but there were also 3 farmers, and they're getting to know that now it's almost better to, if you have a pollinator opportunity, that you get more for pollinators than you get for the corn. So it's happening. Most farmers are preserving grass waterways and other places with prairie, and they're not necessarily mowing alongside the cornfield. If you mow along the cornfield, you're going to chase the insects and whatnot somewhere. But those insects are not used to a monocrop of corn or soybeans. So it's you don't have to worry about it in the first place, because they're not going to go into a cornfield. There's nothing for them to eat or engage with other animals there. So we're looking at farmers who do not mow their territory. And also, they don't mow the Department of Transportation territory. There's some places where there's a little bit of willingness to actually dig up the Department of Transportation territory and go between hammer and poles. So you edge up out a little bit, and every once in a while, the Department of Transportation goes by and pulls out the corn that grows on their territory, because it's an invasion. But so these things we have to discuss, and we have to present a case for, please do not mow 45 at the wrong time of the year. It would be better if you were to mow Canada thistle, which comes to a head in about March or April and May, and by the time you get to August the 1st, when it's mown, it's nice and fluffy and gets spread all over the farms around and the natural areas, and it's kind of a menace. So we're hoping that the Department of Transportation will not only have their existing 12 landscape people, but and Scott was there. Scott is the replacement for Stephanie Dobbs, who's become a statewide preservation person on natural areas that are existing along the roadside. So we'll be talking to Scott, but Scott is from Paris region. Paris region goes north as far as Ludlow and goes south, and so that sort of landscaper is overloaded. There are 12 landscapers in the state and 2,000 otherwise employees. And mostly they're engineers, and they have an engineering background and not a lot of biology. So we discussed this some, and we also discussed the possibility of having a narrower trail. I questioned it. Does the Department of Transportation get involved? Yes, because hiking and biking is an alternate form of transportation. So yes, when money comes from the federal government to improve a trail like the Kickapoo Trail, the first stop for that money is the Department of Transportation, and they take out their interest there and hand over most of the money to the Department of Natural Resources, and then the Natural Resources has a bicycleway division. And so we talk about these things because not everyone understands how the money is distributed. But I really don't like remnant prairie dug up, as with the Westfield Prairie in Oakwood, between Oakwood and Bronson. So can we have a 4-foot corridor that's wide enough for a bicycle? David will know that you don't need more than 4 feet to ride a bicycle?
Excuse me, you're putting words in my mouth, sir. I would honestly say you'd probably best off with a minimum of 6 feet. A bicycle by itself may only seem to be maybe you're 2 feet wide. You really want about 3 feet per person. And if you have people coming toward you, you've got to figure it's going to be a two-way street. Or even if you're the slowpoke and someone is coming up behind you, you need room for both of those people on their bicycles to be able to be safe when they're side by side. In fact, I'm sorry, I'm a solitary bicyclist, but I do know that there are a lot of people that actually go on bike trails with other people. If you want to talk with them, either you're shouting forward to them or listening back over your shoulder, or you're right next to them chatting just side by side. So there are plenty of reasons. I agree with you. 8 feet does seem like really wide. 10 feet, I don't know. It must be a regulation for some reason. But wouldn't be comfortable on a trail that was narrower than about 6 feet. That'd be my best guess.
Well, that's sort of what the Department of Transportation is saying. But if you want to save your prairie, and it's the only prairie around, then you have to think about having some pull-offs where you can pass people, or some people have rich natural areas. They make their trails 18 inches wide, and you can only go one way. You don't have to pass anyone.
Don't get to pass it.
Right, and so we don't have that luxury in Kickapoo Trail. You're going to have traffic going both ways, but at least we should keep to the ballast and not get onto the prairie that has been there for best part of 10,000 years. It's been evolving, and we don't like to see it destroyed. So you have to balance people, recreational needs against genetic needs and needs of people to just have some ambience and not be having a trail through corn on either side. It's interesting. I drove from Mattoon to Arcola, and there's corn on both sides of the road. So you really have lost a lot of your ambiance for natural area, and you also are adjacent to a railroad line which drains itself. So when you have a lot of rain, as we've done in the last season, the corn and soybean that's between the railroad and the road is not going to do very well because of the wetness. And, so let me see what the time is. Okay. So I have a friend that comes from Paris, and just going through the week, we have he's a specialist in bass fishing, and I've never been involved bass fishing. I thought bass fishing was to gather food, but I find it's not. It's a catch and release organization. So you have a boat which has a huge outboard motor on it, and you can go into a lake and find the soft spots where bass can be found, and then you turn off your large motor and you have a trolling motor, and it just moves your boat very slowly, and you find the spots where you can throw a fly, an artificial fly, and pull it through the water and gather up your bass. So this is big time competition. If you have 100 people paying $50, then there is a fairly huge reward for the people who get the heaviest catch. And to keep the fish alive, there are bins where you can store the creatures alive. You can give them some biochemical, which I'm not awfully excited about, to make sure that their injury from being caught is going to repair itself. and then the fish are weighed, and if you have a heavy enough fish and you've caught it in it, there's a time frame on this, and so you may be getting a fairly heavy reward. And there are people who do this, and they are interested in students and others to engage in this recreational experience. And it's rather popular. And so Steve Lux, who has a master's degree in recreation from the University of Illinois, grew up and lives in Paris. And he now has something like 750 bass courses in recreation programs around the state. But if we get a chance, I'll have him on the radio sometime. He, in retirement, drives a bus which brings people to various centers like Terre Haute, and it's for recycling your kidney if it's not working very well. Need dialysis. So he has to wait for them to be dialyzed and travel around. And this is a big organization. Well, we might want to say something about that too sometime. If he is eating fish, he's probably eating walleye. I find the bass is not a eating fish as far as he's concerned. So we talk, and I find out a little bit more about another trade or recreation that I didn't know much about. He probably sets about 6 lines on the back and the sides of the boat, and can work them. The boat is modified for fishing poles, and so there's a lot of know-how in this, and it's kind of fun. And I think he gets a lot of joy out of this. And it's not exactly my bag because I'm not always into catch and release. But so came home, and on Friday night the WIL is working with songs and music that's been created by Illinois. And so they were doing a preview of this at the Virginia Theater. So I went just to find out who's who. Mark Rubel was featured some. There were a lot of people who knew about little places like at Clinton there was a radio station, and somebody got up and said something about that. And that inspired somebody who actually did that to speak. And it was interesting. I couldn't hear the speakers very well. The Ebert Fest has gotten pretty good at microphone work. But they had 4 people, producers and the like, on the stage without microphones. And I thought, well, my hearing must be going, because so I was thinking to get to the doctor to see if it's a problem. But then they opened up to the audience, and the audience people who had headphones and batteries and microphones could move the microphone to the people who spoke, and I could hear every one of them, which sort of said to me that we need microphones up there on stage. And David's been through some of this. Have you done Rubel's course?
I actually did. I took a class. That works differently, though. That making recordings in a studio, it's so much you expect to get fine sound. I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of microphones that these people who run the studios have. They know them by a number. we're using 57s. 57s, no, those are vocal mics. You don't use those to record saxophones. No, we get this really good sound from them. Oh, I would never use that. So the way that you set sound up in a recording studio, you're so spoiled. I can't believe that what it's like for Mark Rubel to go out to a concert, because the sound quality has to be so low compared to what he's used to creating in his own studio.
Well, on Saturday night, I went to the Woodstock film, which was 5 hours long, then got to be 4 hours long, and then got to be 3 hours and something long. But it was very, very good. Not one of those artists had a microphone that was 2 feet away from their face. It was right in their face. And if they wanted to move away, it was for a technique so that you could hear the sound go down. If they were waving it around, they were not singing. But the moment they started to sing, right back. And at the meeting in Mattoon, many people were 2 feet away from the microphone, and there was no one on the board to raise up. And if you're on the board and you have to make it louder, that often cuts off the sigmoid curve. You lose the tops and the bottoms, and it's not as clear. And if many of these people are older people and retirees, and they do have some hearing loss. Mm-hmm. I probably have hearing loss myself too. So I want to find a booklet which I can hand out to meeting people who are natural areas people, to say, please speak into your mic. And there are some people who feel that their voice is strong enough that they don't need to. Excuse me, I don't need to use this. But that means that you don't get to hear so well.
Well, the other problem is the microphone isn't just amplifying the sound so that everyone can hear you clearly in that room. It's also recording you so that they've got the recording of what you said. So if you just yell out to the room, some of that's going to get picked up by the microphone, but not as well as if you actually stood, as you're saying, and got close to the mic and spoke at a reasonable level.
Well, sometimes we have to be understanding of limitations of funding and whatnot, but sometimes, as at the conference, Prairie State Conservation Coalition, there's an air conditioner that provides ambient sound in the background, and there are windows. And if you have photographers that have spent their life putting together slideshows, it is very disappointing to see those slides with a lot of daylight on them. So I would like to reform some of the speakers, and that means you have to get them beforehand, and people who are going to come into the EBIT Fest, for instance, 10 minutes before the show, because they've got to fly in and fly out, they also have to be begged to pay attention to their microphone. They may be big sound people, and but this is talking to the general public, and it's not, as you say, in a studio setting. Somewhat, but often it's open air.
You've got to wonder what it's like to be a movie director, because you're working to get the sound, in a lot of cases, as good as possible. You've actually got a person holding a microphone just above the people who are talking back and forth.
Yes.
But you take this person and put them on a stage themselves, and now you're just the one talking. They forget about all of this stuff, and it doesn't occur to them, oh, I need to follow the exact same rules that I require, because that's my movie that we're talking about.
Yes. So I was... I don't go to the movies very often, but I did want to look at the Woodstock film, and it was just amazing to have 500,000 people in one place on farmland. The farmers were, the farmer that lent his land was very pleased with it because they were very well behaved, and a lot of freedom. It rained in the middle, so they could go slide in the mud, and play around, and it was with limitations for food and other things, but it had very good photographers. They were right up on top of the hand motion of the individuals, and
I wouldn't be surprised if some of the directors, some of the photographers at these that made these films of Woodstock and the last waltz, the last performance by the band called The Band, and at the, I'm blanking on it, the Monterey Pop Festival, went on to be directors themselves. I'm positive some of them were. I'm blanking on people's names now, but if you watch the credits, when you see the names of the actual people running the cameras, you'll recognize them as people who decades later went on to make their own movies.
Well, Hendrix finished, and it's kind of classic music, and they captured his right onto the guitar fingering, and at the same time they were capturing onto the audience that was intrigued, and he was the last player. But I think there was an attempt made to reproduce that. I think it was, 50 years ago? It was a while ago.
They have tried. One of the originators of the Apple company, the computer company, Wozniak, tried to do, and they may have actually pulled it off a little bit. None of these things come through as well as people want them to. They always have these grand ideas. Sound so good, but yes, none of them have come off as well as those old ones. That was 1969, I think, for Woodstock.
Yes,
the old
there's
ones
something
did it.
in the original one. It's a sequence when they make a film, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's
Oh, you're talking about how they're never as good as the first ones, right?
right.
Yes.
So we think about that. 10 minutes. I think I want a little booklet, and perhaps I'll generate that. Let me ask if Susan would like to say something. See, would you?
Well, if I do, I'd probably hog the last 10 minutes. And I don't know whether that's
all right.
okay or not. But I'd like to go back to where Dave started. I knew Charlotte Brady. I didn't know that she had passed. I would have appreciated the service, I'm sure. And in a way, Dave's relationship with Charlotte Brady is so fascinating. And I've been around Dave since Green Street days, and Green Street when the co-ed theater was there on one side and Follett's was on the other side, and then the co-ed 2 was built, and we were living at 624 East Green, which no longer exists. But anyway, so I go back a few years, having come here from New York State on a 9-month contract. I'm still here. So anyway, back to Charlotte. Is this visible now, your bouquet? Well, she she was miraculous. And can you do something with this again? Or, yeah?
We can probably get a copy of it and actually put it
Put it on later.
Yeah, exactly.
Later.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, the very fine handwork, I'll call it, because I'm no artist and I don't have the right words at all, but that she did, and she was able to, when Dave had a little outlet here on the back side,
on Walnut Street.
gallery on Walnut Street, Charlotte, who had been doing all this wonderful work sort of west of us or wherever she was, in Muhammad, brought in some artwork, and it sold like hotcakes when Dave's outlet there. And she was there herself, so I got to meet her and interact with her, and she was, can I say, she was sort of on Dave's model. She could talk on anything. I mean, she knew the details, the fine points of a bouquet of zinnias, I think they are, and the color that they had. And then she could do a very, very fine vine, grapevine or something else, maybe something from the prairie. And her business picked up. It had been in Muhammad and nobody had bought anything. And here she was able to have an outlet. And I just feel as if Dave, who's been around as long as I have in this community and longer in some ways, because he has a huge community in Illinois, that he can talk about any part of it. If anybody wants to talk to Dave about anything, he knows about it too, and he can interact, as the two Daves have been this hour, in such meaningful ways rather than sitting and twiddling your thumbs and wondering what you're going to talk about next. I mean, it's just a range of stuff. And it's intelligent, informed, interested, enthusiastic. And the several years that are reflected in this 50-year relationship, more or less, of knowing that I lived beside Dave on Green Street in the old days, and I'm still in the neighborhood too. After coming, he came from Australia, I came from New York. I mean, here we are, but he can talk on anything, and I can only talk on the wonderful people that I've met here, including Dave and Dave.
Go back to Charlotte, and her husband was Dan Brady, and she got Parkinson's disease, which is very unfortunate, and
Yeah.
she could no longer paint, and so you have to have a lot of sympathy for Parkinson people, because research is being done. It's somewhat related to Alzheimer's, and so in the long run we hope that something will happen. It's more likely to happen than some other things that are associated with the brain, but we really sympathize with Dan following through for a long time. I remember the last public event that I met Charlotte in, I was holding her head up because she could no longer do that. So I think that the week has been rather bit. Oh, we've got 5 minutes. Yeah. So I'm not quite sure. We're still working with teasel. If some of you like to be volunteers on teasel, they're getting somewhat more ripe, so it's likely to drop seed. So on the highway that we're talking to IDOT about, I could really use some help there. And in this case, it's taken off the teasel and the knobs that are producing the seed. So that is good. I should also say that we have people in the Monticello area, and I was meeting them at Charlotte's memorial, and we have there 2 miles of excellent trails. The first trail was put in, it goes across the Sangamon Bridge, a truss bridge that we own. This is an easement, so the city of Monticello didn't want to help us buy the line in the first place, but they did want, once we got it, to put in a trail, and it's a narrow trail. And so the trees are growing on the edge, so you get an idea of that you're on the bottomland. And then you go across the Sangamon River, you can look at the Sangamon River and enjoy it. And then it went to County Farm Road. And at County Farm Road, you can go to Allerton. And there's quite a lot of the development of Monticello is on that side of the river. And so the mile that the city put in between the sewer treatment plant at Monticello and County Farm Road has been used a lot. It means that bicycles don't have to go onto Bridge Road, which is a heavy-duty road coming off of a cloverleaf for 72, and it's just enjoyable. And so they've extended that with another mile to Applewood. And we have, after that, we have 4 miles. And it would be an excellent place for continuing the trail. But that 4 miles to Cisco has wonderful prairie. It's not the world's greatest prairie, but it's what's available locally. And so I'm tempted to say, and have said, let's put people on the retired highway that has been replaced by 72, so all the traffic is on 72. Let's make that a shared road and make sure that it's 45 mile an hour, or it doesn't have to be 70 mile an hour. You don't have to have people driving excessively fast. So keep it on the road and leave the other trail available. And I would like to say available once people get to understand what a prairie is. We have a lot of educating to do, and so I'm not anti-putting a trail in. In fact, that's what we went to bought the line in the first place, was for prairie, for trails, and re-rail if necessary. And but we're looking at the prairie at the moment, and I was talking to people who are there, and we need to raise volunteers to work with that sort of situation. And so this is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And
thank you for Susan for coming in.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.